The house was too quiet. A stillness hung in the air, heavy like the humidity outside. Our parents had left that morning for their anniversary trip, a last-minute escape, leaving the two of us behind. It wasn't the first time Michael and I had been left alone together, but something about this summer felt different. Michael, my stepbrother, was sprawled on the couch, his shirt riding up slightly, revealing the sharp lines of his abdomen. The sight made my stomach tighten inexplicably, though I quickly turned away before he could notice. I busied myself with my phone, pretending the buzz of a notification was far more interesting than the tension that had quietly grown between us over the past few months. "You're awfully quiet today," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced up to see him watching me. His hazel eyes were keen, too perceptive, as though he could see straight through the thin veneer of nonchalance I'd tried to build. "I'm always quiet," I replied, hoping my voice sounded as light as I intended. Michael smirked, that lopsided grin that made it impossible to tell whether he was teasing or simply being himself. "Yeah, but today it's different." I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just tired." He didn't say anything more, but I could feel his eyes lingering. The silence stretched between us, not awkward but weighted, like the atmosphere just before a storm. Michael didn't move from the couch, but I could feel his attention following me as I stood and headed toward the kitchen. The distance between us felt more like a gap in time than space, as though every step I took was dragging a tether between us. The air conditioning hummed softly, but it did nothing to cool the heat crawling up the back of my neck. I leaned against the counter, gripping the cool edge to steady myself. The sound of him shifting behind me, just the faint creak of the couch, made my stomach flip. I hated how attuned I was to his every movement, how his presence seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. "Are you making something?" he called from the living room. "No," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I meant. "Just thinking." A pause. Thinking about what? The lightness in his tone didn't fool me. Michael always had a way of asking questions that felt like traps, even if he didn't mean them that way. I turned, crossing my arms over my chest, and leaned against the doorway so I could see him. He was lying back now, one arm thrown casually over the back of the couch, his head tilted as he looked at me. His expression was open, curious, but his eyes, they seemed to catch and hold me in place. "Nothing important," I muttered, trying to sound dismissive, but the way his gaze swept over me made my throat tighten. "Come sit," he said, patting the space next to him. "I'm fine here." He raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "What's with the attitude today? You mad at me or something?" "No," I said too quickly. "Why would I be?" Michael shrugged, but there was something in the way his smirk lingered that made my chest tighten. "Suit yourself," he said, stretching his long legs out on the coffee table. "I'm just saying it's weird. You're acting off. Office." He wasn't wrong, but hearing him say it aloud made my pulse quicken. I clenched the edge of the doorway, my knuckles whitening. His gaze slid over me again, slower this time, as though he was trying to read a language written across my skin. I felt exposed, like he could see all the thoughts I'd been trying so hard to suppress. "It's nothing," I said again, forcing my voice to steady. He tilted his head, his grin fading into something softer, more contemplative. "You're a terrible liar, you know that." I tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained. Michael just watched me for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before he shifted his attention back to the TV. Relief and disappointment warred within me, but I didn't dare acknowledge either. I turned back into the kitchen, staring blankly at the refrigerator as though its contents might offer me some kind of escape. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. I was still standing there, lost in thought, when I heard his footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze. He hadn't made a sound before now, and the sudden closeness of his presence was jarring. "You sure you're okay?" His voice was low, closer than I expected. I turned, only to find him leaning against the counter beside me, so near that the edge of his shoulder brushed mine. It was the barest contact, but it sent a shiver racing down my spine. His proximity was overwhelming. The scent of his skin, clean, faintly citrusy, filling the small space between us. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. I hated how obvious it sounded, how transparent I felt under his gaze. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice soft but insistent. His eyes searched mine, and I felt the weight of his scrutiny, the pull of his presence like gravity drawing me in despite myself. I started, but the words faltered. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't know what I could say. Michael's brow furrowed slightly, his lips parting as though he was about to speak again, but instead he paused. His eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, just a flicker, but it was enough to make my breath hitch. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the tension between us thick and electric, and it was too much. I stepped away abruptly, the sudden movement breaking the spell that had settled over us. "I'm going to go upstairs," I said quickly, not looking at him. "I just need some space." Michael didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes on my back as I hurried up the stairs. The sound of his voice stopped me just as I reached the top. "Hey," he called, and when I turned to look back, his expression was unreadable, a strange mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. "Don't shut me out, okay?" His words lingered in the air long after I closed the door to my room. The door clicked softly behind me, but it didn't shut out the world. My mind was still racing, my heart pounding as though I'd just run a mile. I leaned against the wood, willing myself to breathe, to calm down. The image of Michael's face, so close, too close, kept flashing in my mind. That flicker in his eyes, the one I couldn't name, seemed burned into my memory. I crossed the room in quick strides, collapsing onto my bed. The ceiling fan spun lazily above me, but it did little to cut through the warmth that clung to my skin. My thoughts swirled, chaotic and relentless. What was wrong with me? What was I even feeling? Michael's words echoed in my head. "Don't shut me out." They shouldn't have meant anything. He'd said them so casually, like a throwaway line. But they didn't feel casual. They felt heavy, loaded with something I didn't want to unpack. I closed my eyes, trying to shove the thoughts away, but the effort was futile. Every time I tried to think of something else, my mind looped back to the moments we'd shared downstairs. The weight of his gaze, the closeness of his body, the way his voice had softened as he spoke to me. A knock at the door snapped me out of my spiral. My chest tightened instantly. "Yeah?" I called, though my voice cracked. "It's me." "Michael." I hesitated. "What do you want?" There was a pause. "To talk." My throat tightened. "I'm tired. Can it wait?" "Not really." His voice was calm but firm. Another pause. I didn't move to open the door, but I didn't tell him to leave either. A moment later, I heard the faint creak of the door as he pushed it open. My pulse spiked. Michael stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't ask permission. He never did. That was just him, confident, unbothered by boundaries that didn't seem to matter to him. "I thought I said I was tired," I muttered, sitting up but not meeting his eyes. "You also said you were fine earlier," he said, leaning against the wall and crossing his arms. "But that wasn't true either, was it?" I glared at him, heat rising in my chest. "What do you want from me, Michael?" His eyes flickered, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied me in that quiet, calculating way of his, as though he was piecing together a puzzle. The silence stretched, thick and charged. "I want you to stop pretending," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but the words hit like a hammer. My heart pounded. "Pretending what?" "You know what?" I shook my head, looking away. "I don't know what you're talking about." Michael pushed off the wall, taking a step closer. "Yeah, you do." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. I stood abruptly, needing to put distance between us. I crossed to the window, staring out at the darkened yard, but I could feel him behind me. His presence was magnetic. impossible to ignore. "You don't have to keep running from it," he said, his voice softer now. "Whatever this is, it's not just in my head, is it?" The question hung in the air, pulling at something deep inside me. My hands gripped the windowsill, my knuckles white. "You're crazy," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" I turned to face him, my chest tight. He was closer than I realized, just a few steps away. His eyes locked onto mine, steady and unflinching. There was no smirk now, no teasing glint, just quiet intensity. "I don't know what you want me to say," I whispered. "Tell me the truth." The truth? What even was the truth? That I'd spent months trying not to notice the way his laugh made my stomach flutter? That I hated how my heart raced every time he brushed against me? How my skin burned where his touch lingered? That I didn't know how to look at him anymore without feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet? I shook my head, backing up a step. "There's nothing to say." Michael's jaw tightened. "You're lying." "I'm not." "Yes, you are." He took another step forward, and suddenly, he was in my space again, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "You think I don't notice? The way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention? The way you freeze up when I get too close?" I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. Michael's voice dropped lower. "You think I don't feel it too?" My breath caught. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the inches of space between us. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, so light it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. My skin tingled where his fingers lingered, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. He leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't tell anyone," he said, his words a quiet plea. And then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push him back, but my body betrayed me. My fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer as heat surged through me. The world tilted, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst. His hands found my waist, steadying me as the kiss deepened. It was too much and not enough all at once, every nerve in my body on fire. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine, his hands still gripping my hips. "Michael," I started, but he shook his head. "Don't," he murmured. "Just don't." Michael's forehead pressed lightly against mine, his breath warm and shallow against my skin. My hands were still fisted in his shirt, holding on as though letting go would send me spiraling into free fall. Every nerve in my body was firing, but my mind was blank, unable to process what had just happened. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me, and the intensity in his gaze made my chest tighten. His hazel eyes searched mine, as if trying to read the thoughts I couldn't put into words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though his voice lacked regret. I shook my head, my throat dry. "Why did you do that?" "Because I couldn't not do it anymore," he said simply, his hands still resting lightly on my hips. "I've been fighting it for months. I thought maybe I could ignore it, but I can't. Not when it's you." His words hit me like a wave, and I stumbled back, putting space between us. His hands fell away reluctantly, but he didn't try to stop me. The weight of what had just happened, of what he was saying, pressed down on me, suffocating. "This is insane," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "We can't. This isn't—" Michael took a step toward me, his expression calm but determined. "I know it's not simple, okay? But don't stand there and tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. He was right. I did feel it. The pull, the connection, the fire that sparked every time he was near. I hated it. I hated how real it was, how undeniable. "This can't happen," I said finally, my voice trembling. It's not right." "Why not?" His voice was steady, unyielding. Who decides what's right and wrong, huh? You think I planned this? You think I wanted to feel this way about you?" His words sliced through me, raw and honest, and I had no response. He took another step closer, closing the distance I'd just put between us. "I didn't choose this," he said, his voice softer now. "But I can't pretend it's not there anymore. I won't." The vulnerability in his tone made my chest ache. This was Michael, so confident, so self-assured, and yet here he was, laying everything bare. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then help me understand," he said. His hand brushed against mine, tentative and light, but the contact sent a jolt through me. "Talk to me. Tell me what you're feeling." I shook my head, my jaw tightening. "I can't." "Yes, you can." His insistence made my resolve falter. My hands clenched into fists at my sides as I struggled to keep the flood of emotions at bay. "Do you have any idea what this could do to us?" I asked, my voice rising. "To our family? To everything?" Michael's expression didn't waver. "This is about us," he said firmly. "Not anyone else, not them. Just you and me." The simplicity of his words made my head spin. He spoke as though it was that easy, as though the world outside this room didn't exist. "I can't do this," I said, stepping back again. "I don't even know what this is." Michael exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly, but his eyes never left mine. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now," he said. "I just need you to stop lying to yourself. To me." "I'm not lying," I snapped, though the crack in my voice betrayed me. He tilted his head, a faint, sad smile tugging at his lips. "Then, tell me to leave. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel anything for me. That you want me to walk out that door and never bring this up again." I froze, my mouth dry. The words hovered on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't force them out. My heart pounded, each beat reverberating in my chest like a drum. Michael took another step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Say it, and I'll go. I swear." The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing. My hands trembled at my sides, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But I couldn't say it. Michael saw the hesitation in my silence, and something in his eyes shifted. He reached out slowly, giving me plenty of time to pull away, and cupped my cheek in his hand. His touch was gentle, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said softly. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what could have happened if I'd just been honest." The vulnerability in his voice shattered the last of my defenses. My chest tightened painfully, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch. The shift was subtle but undeniable, and Michael's hand slipped to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. This time, when his lips met mine, it wasn't tentative. It was raw, full of emotion, a current of electricity sparking between us. I gave in. Every rational thought dissolved as his arms wrapped around me, holding me like I might disappear. My hands clutched at his shoulders, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, leaving no space between us. The weight of the world outside the room melted away, leaving only this moment, this connection. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads pressed together. The silence that followed was deafening. My breathing was ragged, my body trembling as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Michael's hands slid down to rest on my waist, steadying me. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. "Don't tell anyone," he whispered again, and this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a plea. The room felt suspended in time, the quiet between us heavy with everything we'd said and done. My heart raced as I stood there, still feeling the warmth of his hands on my waist, the ghost of his lips against mine. I didn't know what to say. Words seemed too small for what was unraveling inside me. Michael stayed close, his forehead brushing mine, his breath mingling with my own. "Say something," he murmured, his voice thick with vulnerability. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I don't know what to say. Say what you're feeling, he urged, his tone soft but insistent. Even if it's messy, even if you're scared. Scared didn't begin to cover it. My chest was tight with 1,000 emotions, all of them tangled and knotted, impossible to sort through. But one stood out, strong, undeniable, and terrifying. I hesitated, my voice trembling. I feel like I'm falling. Michael's hands tightened slightly on my waist, grounding me. You're not falling alone, he said. His words hit me like a lightning strike, and something inside me cracked. I closed my eyes, leaning into him, and let the weight of the moment pull me under. His arms wrapped around me fully, holding me close, and for the first time, I let myself stop fighting. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, tangled in each other, the world outside our door forgotten. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my chest, and it calmed the storm inside me. When I finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, still holding that quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away. We can figure this out, he said softly. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this could be simple, that the connection between us could exist without shattering everything around it. But reality loomed just outside the door, and I couldn't ignore it forever. What happens when they come back? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look away. We'll deal with it when it happens. For now, let's just have this. His words were both comforting and terrifying. I wanted this, more than I could admit to myself, but I didn't know if I was strong enough to carry the weight of it. Michael seemed to sense my hesitation. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle, grounding. Look at me, he said, and I met his gaze reluctantly. I'm not going to let you face this alone. Whatever happens, I'm here. Always. Something in his voice broke through my fear, and I nodded slowly. Okay. His lips curved into a small, soft smile, and he leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a kiss that was light but filled with promise. The days that followed felt surreal. We slipped into a strange rhythm, balancing on the edge of something fragile and unspoken. When our parents called to check in, we kept our voices steady, our answers rehearsed. When the house was quiet, we stole moments, glances, touches, whispers that carried the weight of everything we couldn't say aloud. But the closer their return came, the more the reality of our situation pressed down on me. Every day felt like a countdown, each tick of the clock reminding me that the bubble we'd created couldn't last forever. The night before they were due back, Michael found me in the kitchen. I was staring out the window, the darkness outside mirroring the storm inside me. He approached quietly, his footsteps soft against the tile. "You've been quiet all day," he said, his voice low. I didn't turn to look at him. "I've been thinking. About what happens next." His silence stretched, and I could feel him standing behind me, close but not touching. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. The question caught me off guard, and I turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my chest ache. "No," I said, the word coming out stronger than I expected. "I don't regret it. I don't know how this works." Michael stepped closer, his hands finding mine. "It works because we make it work," he said simply. "It doesn't have to look like anything else. It just has to be us." His confidence was steadying, but doubt still lingered in the back of my mind. What if it falls apart? "Then we pick up the pieces," he said, his grip on my hands tightening. "But I'd rather try and risk breaking than never try at all." The sincerity in his voice left no room for argument. I nodded, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. He leaned in then, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that felt different from the others. Deeper, more certain, as though he was sealing a promise. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his eyes closed. "I love you," he whispered, the words so soft they were almost lost in the quiet. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't speak, but as his words settled over me, something inside me clicked into place. "I love you too," I whispered back. The words felt like a leap into the unknown, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The next day, when our parents came home, everything changed again. The bubble burst, and we slipped back into our roles. Stepbrothers, a family, nothing more. But every glance, every accidental touch, carried the weight of what we'd shared. And at night, when the house was quiet and the world couldn't see, he found me. In the stolen moments between everything we were supposed to be, we found each other. The future was uncertain, the risks terrifying. But as Michael held me in the dark, his arms wrapped around me like a shield, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, we would face it together.